good morning, everyone, and welcome to this. And it's my first shot at hosting a Zoom seminar or webinar or forum. Don't know what word to call it, but I'm pretty apprehensive about doing this because having attended the National Homeless Conference via Zoom and having all the things that could go wrong going wrong, even with professionals and technologists involved, and the fact that they charge $200. So if they can't get it right, we're probably going to have a few problems, but we'll get going. So we're recording this, so just letting you all know it'll be up on our website. Anyway, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of land on which we work and live. NT Shelter recognises their continued connection to the land, pay our respects to leaders past, present and future. In Darwin, we recognise the Larrakia people. This session came about because NT Shelter have been looking into best practice in the tenancy support space. And what we learned is that across Australia and the world, similar programs operate and they all have incidents of failure. But one thing is evident, everyone seems to say act early and act quickly. Unfortunately, I don't think that happens all the time, and we often trying to save tenancies right at the back end rather than at the start. So this search for best practice led me to the Council of Homeless Persons in Victoria and their peer education and support program. So the presenters today will give you a bit of a rundown on the broader peer program. But what we're learning about today is the employment of people with lived experience to help newly tenanted people with a history of homelessness start off their tenancy on the right note. So I'm sure you'll correct me if I got that wrong. So I don't know about you, but I think the way that I live was influenced by my parents. I grew up in a safe, secure home. I lived in a house, but I grew up in a home. If I hadn't had a house or a home when I was young, how would I have learnt the skills to establish a home when given a house in adulthood? As a 40-year-old man, well, actually I'm 50, but 55, would I have respected the advice of a 20-something caseworker? Maybe yes, maybe no. So I see lived experience as being an important part of a preventative approach to homelessness. So this session is to hear about the CHP program. So feel free to send through your questions and we'll put them to the panel at the end of each talk. The Zoom will be recorded. It's made available through the NT Shelter website and a link will be on our next newsletter. The outcome of today's Zoom is for NT Shelter to gauge the sector's support for establishing a similar program in the Northern Territory. The support we require is both moral and practical. If there is interest, we'd like to form an advisory group to take the concept to the next stage. And this will include understanding how a program will work given consideration to the Northern Territory's unique cultures. So first up, I'd like to welcome and thank Ian Gough. Ian is currently Manager, Capacity Building Consumer Programs at Council to Homeless Persons, which is the peak body for homelessness in Victoria, so cousins to NT Shelter. During his 20 plus years in the community sector, Ian has worked in the residential care, family, youth and homeless sectors, with most of experience being in the homeless sector. Ian is committed to social justice, person-centred practice and consumer participation. Ian manages CHP's capacity building and activities and consumer programs, the peer education support program and the homelessness advocacy service. Current focus of his work is in the capacity building space, is the development of the SHS learning program for homeless sector and the implementation of the recently developed specialist homelessness sector workforce development strategy. So maybe we'll be talking to him about that later, another session. So Ian, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. And also I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, and we're all in different parts of Melbourne here and obviously the NT up there. Pay my respects to their elders past and present and any elders we have with us today and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here at the meeting today. I'm in Altona, so we're still in working from home. We've just come out of a short, sharp lockdown. So, but me and many of my colleagues are still working from home down in Victoria. So we're all in different spots. So hopefully all of our Zoom works. So yeah, thanks, Mike. It was terrific for Mike to reach out to ask us to, well, first of all, to have a conversation about peer support. It's something that we're really passionate about at CHP. CHP, as Mike said, is the peak body for homelessness in Victoria. And with us today, we'll have Cass will speak with a focus on the peer support project. But we're the peak body of homelessness in Victoria. We represent everyone in Victoria who's got an interest in ending homelessness. The focus for today from my end, obviously, is the peer support element. So I'll talk a little bit about a project that we were funded to deliver by. We received funding from the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation in the City of Melbourne down in Melbourne. And I'll talk a little bit about that project, where it came from, what we learned from the project, and sort of the next steps for the project. One of the goals of the project was to really embed or increase the amount of peer support work in our sector in Victoria and more broadly. And so something like this is a terrific opportunity to help meet that aim. The background really to the project was we've operated the peer education support program that Mike mentioned since 2005, so 16 years now. PES is a program of volunteers who consumers, we refer to them as consumers, so it's a consumer participation program. And they do a range of things for CHP, super important for CHP. They inform all of our internal policies. They sit on our interview panels. They are involved in our media. They influence government policy on any number of government networks and panels. We've been very successful in encouraging our state government to use consumers, and PESPA are the go-to program. Part of our role is trying to encourage participation, consumer participation being embedded across the sector. We find it's really important. One of the keys to that we've found in the success of it is having an identified resource who manages it at the organisation level, and Cass does that role fantastically for us at CHP. She's the PES team leader. So the PES do a bunch of stuff for us. As I said, they're involved in informing government policy and also informing how programs are designed at the service level. But a key focus for them too is communicating to the community outside of our bubble in our homelessness sector about what homelessness is and not having a home is. They're a huge resource for us in terms of our community outreach, but also advising us on what we should be doing to do a better job to end homelessness and to build better design a better service system. And I've been at CHP now for about 10 years. And in that time that I've been there, PES members have consistently spoken about the struggle of establishing a home or their housing after experience of not having a home. And one of the key things that we've got this message consistently ever since I've been involved at PES, but even before that, when I was a worker in the sector or working in the sector, is that I'm not sure how it is in Northern Territory, but the demand in Victoria for services, homelessness services, is huge. And often the support people are receiving whilst they don't have a home from homelessness services stops pretty much once they're housed. And so we had a consultation back in 2017 to inform a presentation we were doing at our annual state conference. We wanted to know, the question that we asked, we brought a group of consumers together, our PES members, but also consumers from Launch Housing, Salvation Army, Melbourne City Mission, and some other people with lived experience. Joelle was there that day. We really wanted to explore what post-homelessness support would look like. So what I mean by that is the sort of supports people need having been without a home and moving into a new home. The response we got to that question about how they felt when they moved into a house after not having a home was really powerful, and not what we expected, to be honest. It was quite moving, and really, to be honest, quite upsetting. People spoke really of struggling for a long time after moving into a house, dealing with the trauma they'd experienced, and how long, and in many cases was still taking, how long it was taking to get close to having that house feel like it was truly their home. I don't know, part of why it was so moving was that I guess, whilst we expected some of those sorts of responses, it was so uniform, and so many people said the same thing. And I guess sort of subconsciously, maybe from a homelessness sector perspective, I'm thinking, well, people are happy once they've got their house. So we were wanting to explore what sort of supports could be put in place, but what that group really said, what would be most helpful would be peer support, because rather than, whilst support workers are helpful, what they really needed was a peer support who's had the experience of having been homeless, having not had a home before, and making a new house a home. And PESP have said that for a long time for us, that a peer support, someone who they identify would have been super helpful during the resettlement and stabilization phase after not having a home for a long time, or a short period even. And that would be really helpful in terms of achieving their goals and their life outcomes, and having positive life outcomes. And so that really led us to focusing on peer support as a model that we wanted to explore. And so with the support of that group of consumers and our PESP, we set out, and we got funding, as I said, from the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation and City of Melbourne. We put in a proposal for what we call the Peer Support Resettlement Project. And I'll just briefly go through that project today. The Peer Support Resettlement Project, or PSRP, we need a vowel in there, had two stages. The first stage was from July 2018 to about April 2019. That stage involved us designing and developing the model, basically. So we were really focused on designing a replicable model, peer support resettlement model. By that, I mean replicable by other homelessness services. And in that stage, we did research, we did literature review, we worked on program design, we developed the partnerships with the organisations that would have peer workers with them, because we're not a direct service organisation. We also recruited and trained our peer workers. We held information sessions for the sector, for interested people, for peers. We had a number of them. We ran training. We ran training with Wellways for both prospective peer workers and for managers who ended up managing peer workers. And then the second stage was from April 2019, when we employed 3 peer workers. Joelle was one of them, and she'll speak later. And to the end of June 2020, when the project finished. So I guess in terms of the design, one thing is important. So we're really focused on the resettlement stage and the stabilization. So by that, we mean that period of time when someone has not had a home and they've got their permanent home or their home. They're often community housing or social housing, and that what we refer to as resettlement there, and stabilization, and sort of getting it set up. But really, in more simple terms, it's about making that house a home. So that's a really important element. And the other element was right from the beginning. It's not so much about the sort of experience in the peer space of having been without a home before or homeless. So that's not really the experience we were looking for. The experience we were looking for is actually successfully going through that and making a house a home. That's that became increasingly important in our thinking and our program design, that idea, because one, it's, this skill set isn't that at some stage you've been homeless. That's not what we're looking for. The skill set is successfully creating home, and that's a different set of skills, I guess. But also the other aspect to that is that everyone's moved into a new home. It's a universal, home's a universal concept. And everyone at stages, I know myself, I can't even count the number of houses I've moved into and had to go through that process of moving in and somehow making that house into a home. So that was a really important underpinning of our thinking and our design. There were a number of elements informing the design of the project, of the peer support resettlement project. It was input from consumers, as I noted. We're very influenced by the experience of Wellways right from the beginning of the project. Wellways at the state conference that I mentioned presented at that same session where we presented our findings. We did an evidence-based review and we formed a project advisory group. And Mike mentioned the idea, hopefully, of that you might explore in Northern Territory of forming one. The project advisory group was critical, absolutely critical to the project. And it was really heartening how enthusiastic that group was and, their contribution to the project. Wellways that Daisy will speak to, but we've got a number of successful peer support roles across their programs. In the post-homelessness sport as well in Doorways. And they've demonstrated that through the external evaluations of their peer support programs in particular, that it's effective. It improves wellbeing, increases social contact, reduces costs to government, reduces stigma, reduces depression and anxiety, and improves self-management. And that there's also other research supporting the effectiveness of peer support as a complement to traditional services such as case management roles for people without a home. Why I raise that is because we weren't looking to prove the model. We weren't setting out to prove that peer support works. Our starting point was that because of the work Wellways had done and the evaluations they'd done, is that it does work. So really, as I said, our goal was to create a replicable model. And so, it's something that we can, for instance, share with Northern Territory about what worked. Daisy will talk about this in more detail, but the model that Wellways used for peer support is a trauma-informed humanistic framework called intentional peer support. And we from the beginning, once in our design, we said that that's going to be our framework. And that was a really important decision for the project. And I'll touch on it a few times. I'm sure Cass will. It's a really important theme, is that it's critical for peer support to work, that it's attached to a practice framework. It can't just be an airy-fairy. What do peers do? Where it drifts between helping people or, being a concierge or, and Joelle will talk to the importance of that too, no doubt. It's super important that there's an identified practice framework, because critical is that it's seen within a team and externally as a discipline. And without a practice framework to continually return to, then it's not really discipline. And the intentional peer support is a framework that, after much looking around, but largely because the experience of Wellways was very helpful for us in terms of it, was what we landed on. So the advisory group, as I said, played a super important role, and they were made up of people with lived experience of not having a home, and the 3 partner organisations that we brought into the project, which was Salvation Army, Sacred Heart Mission and Launch Housing, and Wellways as well were also involved in that. Those 3 partner organisations ended up where we employed 3 peer workers, and they were outposted at each of them, and they all run the programs that the peer workers were outposted to run programs for people who had a long period of rough sleeping before getting housing. So that was the target group, people with a history of what's called chronic homelessness. So 2-3 years of rough sleeping and going into the house. So it's a very particular sort of targeted group. At the end of that the 9 months of design phase, the model had the following elements. We employed 3 peer workers, peer support workers, we called them, with the lived experience of not having a home. And as I said, more importantly, moving into a permanent house and making that a home. All the applicants were encouraged to participate in the peer support training and the 2-day Wellways Foundation training that we organised. Our model was directly informed by the Wellways and the intentional peer support practice model. Intentional peer support training was mandatory for the peer support workers. That was an important part of the model. That all the clients of the peer support workers had to have a support services actively involved, one of the ones I just mentioned. The target client group were people that have secured permanent housing after not having a home. I mentioned the 3 partner agencies, and that a peer worker was outposted one peer worker was outposted at each one of them. This was something that we didn't begin with, but the advisory group thought was very influential in this aspect of it. So and we think this is an important element of the project and any of peer support, that their peer support workers are part of a multidisciplinary team at each partner agency. And that's really important because, one, it reinforces that the peer role is a discipline. 2, it means that they're part of a team, all trying to achieve positive outcomes for people, and that it recognises that team brings different things to the team. So you might have a clinical psychologist, for instance, or someone who's in the team who's got health focus, a doctor or a nurse, and a case manager in all cases, and the peer worker. And so we'll touch on that a little bit, but role clarity becomes very important, and I know Cass will pick that up. And that team really is about, there'll be a mutual case plan for the clients. And so the work that the peer support workers do, looks to help achieve case planning goals, but they're not case managers. So that's one of the challenges. So when we recruited, the key criteria, the 2 criteria we had for the 3 positions was that experience, as I mentioned before, of making a house a home. And really the other most important thing was the skills to deliver peer work in alignment with the intentional peer support practice model. That was critical. They had to understand the model, their values had to align with it, and they needed to be able to deliver it in alignment. It was a bit complex, but we recruited and employed the workers, so we managed them, but then they were outposted, which had its challenges, administratively more than anything else. And as I said, they worked on programs, the peer support workers worked on programs that support people in long-term housing who have multiple complex support needs, a history of chronic homelessness. I'm not sure if in Northern Territory you have the program, but Streets to Home program, Launch in Salvation Army, and J2SI, which is Sacred Heart Mission, which is Journey to Social Inclusion. They are the programs that the peer support workers worked on. They started with us in April 2019 and delivered peer support until the project finished at the end of June last year. The alignment with the intentional peer support is super important. As I said, it's a discipline. That's really was one of our key findings, that it's critical that it's seen as a discipline, and that the expertise of the peer worker is respected and valued by the team the multidisciplinary team that they work within, the organisation that they work within as well, and externally, looking in. That's really important. This was driven by the advisory group, but that they had to be. It works best. Obviously, it's the same for everyone, but when they're seen, the peer workers seen as an important valued member of a multidisciplinary team and a part of a group of people all trying to achieve something for clients. The key aim was simple, really, of the role, and that was to help people make their house their home. And we put together a position description which we can share, which was really important. The process of developing that was really important because it's like, well, what are the peer workers actually going to do? But we kept on coming back to that. This is what their role is to not do this for people, because that's not in alignment with the intentional peer support, but it's all about helping someone make the house that they've got into a home. The sort of responsibilities and activities specific to the role were supporting connection to community, participation in the multidisciplinary team, building consumer skills, establishing a home, and emotional support. Those were the key things that the peer worker did, or in the sort of at a very high level in the theme. In terms of our key project learnings, there were a number of key project learnings that we, in terms of informing, replicable model from other homelessness services. I should say that there are very few examples of homelessness, of peer support in our space in Victoria, and not that we could find elsewhere in Australia either. So as Daisy will touch on, it's much more common in the mental health and disability sectors, very much less so in our sector in Victoria, in the homelessness sector. And the project was about trying to change that. The key project learnings for us were that using the intentional peer support practice model as a framework is essential. Super important is role clarity. Can't emphasize that enough. In terms of the design of the and implementation of the peer worker roles, and having something to come back to with the peer workers and reflecting on that. Peer support workers, as I said, need to be part of a multidisciplinary team, collectively working together to achieve positive outcomes. The position description is super important, and it needs to make those roles and responsibilities and activities that the workers do really clear. So you've constantly, that's important in any case. And I think that was another learning for us. Whenever questions came up about, well, what about, there was a question at one point in the advisory group, well, what happens if someone shares something that's, about their experience that's upsetting? And and there are any number of similar questions. The answer to that is what would happen in any normal workplace. It's a paid employed position. It's a discipline. So, people bring all sorts of experience to their roles, not just people who have had a lived experience of not having a home. That was a grounding point that was really important, because we came back to that point a lot. I think something we definitely learned that we probably didn't do as well as in hindsight that we would if we were doing it again is preparing peer workers to join a team and get back into that rhythm of work, because we did a lot of work with the teams. That was really important. That was another learning that we needed to, and Cass in particular went to the teams and spent time with them explaining what the model is and what we were looking to achieve. But I think that in hindsight, that some sort of preparation for the peer workers themselves in terms of, how to get used to working in an office again in a team, and all of the sort of systems that you need to do that, if you've been working for any length of time, you sort of take for granted. That was another key learning. So for us, even though we didn't set out to prove peer support works, it really showed us that it's very hard to replicate that power of a peer role. And that's really so, one of the other learnings is how much power plays has an impact in the relationship between workers and clients or consumers. And one of in the advisory group meetings, our person with lived experience was saying the thing that when they moved into their house is that, and this sticks to me, always think about it, was that they went for a week without any electricity or hot water, because he didn't feel comfortable. He was too embarrassed to ask his worker how to turn on the power, because he felt that they would think he's stupid, and he's certainly anything but. But he made the very sort of clear point that if he had a peer worker, he wouldn't have felt that. He would have felt fully comfortable to say, how do I get the power on? How do I turn it on? And there are any other there are a number of other examples that came up through the project. We really believe that peer support helps people achieve outcomes for consumers, and it's perfectly suited to that post-homelessness phase around setting up and stabilizing house, but there's other spaces that it could be used in. But this was our project and our focus, and I think it's particular because people, if they've moved into their home, and at least they've got a stable base to start doing things. So we think it's a great space for peer support, in particular intentional peer support, because it's so focused on relationships, and as everyone knows, relationships take time to build, and in crisis people often don't have that time. It reduces isolation, improves life skills, builds community connection, definitely improve mental health and improve well-being. And a couple of the quotes from managers supervising peer support workers sort of capture those outcomes, I think. And one of them was, relationships are building quicker with the peer support workers than with case workers. There is an instant level of understanding because, as one client told me, the peer worker just gets it. And then another said, a client told me that until she met a peer worker, she thought homelessness would never end. So as I said, the key objective of the project was really, or the main one, was about saying, here's a model. We want to promote it. We want peer support as a valuable and important discipline in the specialist homelessness sector that can contribute to positive outcomes. We're looking to, the project was looking to do that. We've had some success already. All three of those positions were refunded permanently by the department down here with additional hours. That was something we initially only had 10 hours for each of the peer workers. That was another learning. It wasn't enough. So they're now, I think, 20, I forget, but at least double that, I think. So that was another learning. I think just the other thing to emphasize is a learning is that peer work, again, it's a discipline and it's an employed position. It's not participation. So I began by talking about the role of PESP and what PESP do. They're consumer participation group, and the two are different, and it's a really important distinction to make, because peer workers aren't consumers who are there to be good around the edges. It's a really important role. Consumer participation is a different thing. It's important. Where there's an opportunity for connection is that we, for instance, promoted the peer worker role to all of the consumer groups that I'd mentioned before and others in our sector. And our experience is lots of people who do volunteer for consumer participation groups often are looking for work afterwards, and it's a very hard bridge to find. People are saying, look, I don't want to go back to school, and I'm competing with people with social work degrees, and I don't want to go back and do that. I'm 40 or whatever. That's not something that I want to do, and it's a real barrier. Peer work provides an opportunity for employment pathways from participation and other groups, which we think is super important, not least because you then start getting some real diversity in your workforce, and you limit some of the barriers to diversity, for instance, the need to get a recognised qualification. So sort of with that, I'm happy to take any questions. And
just get my mute off. Thanks, Ian. That was great. People watching in, feel free to type in any questions down Q&A. I guess with your advisory group, you mentioned that you had lived experience people on that group. Were they taken from your first peer group where they've sort of had support, some encouragement, or were they used people just fresh off the streets, for want of a better word? What level of capacity did they need to have to be able to participate in that advisory group with people from those other agencies that jumped on board?
So a PESP member. So an advantage for us with PESP is that they begin the project. They're on the program for 2 years, and they begin with training, and Cass does 8 weeks training where, there's a whole range of things that are addressed in that training. And that's an advantage we've got. I think that it's something that our experience is in that case. I think there was one consumer company. Did we have two, Cass? It was at least one. Maybe there was
There was a second one from another consumer group.
Yeah, that's right. Is it often, Mike, consumers do need support? PESPA we've got support from CAS, and they get regular supervision, and early days in the project, they need perhaps more support, but, by the second year, for instance, they're generally super confident in that space. That's one of the things that we train them to do, and they can sort of hit the ground running, and they're comfortable to do it. It's a challenge to do, to have consumer participation in things like advisory group. There are things you need to think through, and one of them is how comfortable people are. We would always urge there to be at least 2 consumers in any advisory group, because otherwise it's doubly challenging for someone often. And just so the other thing is that it's important with consumers on things like advisory group that they're not seen as representative of all consumers. They're a voice, their voice. They bring their own experience to it, but they're not representative of all of the people who are have got the experience of not having a home.
So, got a question from Vicky, and she wants to know how, and maybe this could be answered at the end of the session, but how much more successful do you think your peer support model program is compared to normal case management program? I guess they're different things.
Look, I think that's where the multidisciplinary, where it's important that it's part of a multidisciplinary team, because when it's standalone, I think that was something that we didn't begin the project design with, but it was very clear that all of the agencies had a multidisciplinary focus and that it needed to sit within that team. I think that it's a challenge to demonstrate efficacy for anything in any of our projects. Who does what? How? So, but my sense is the very consistent message we got from Wellways, from peers, from PESP, is about how much more honest and comfortable people can be with peers as opposed to workers, and it keep coming as opposed to case managers and support workers, because they're workers as well, is about the power imbalance feels less, and that kept coming up about power and about that it's less of an imbalance with peer workers.
Excellent. And NT Mental Health Coalition have just chimed in. So they've been working with Wellways. Yep. So that's good. So we'll tap into their knowledge. Excellent. Okay. So no more questions. So